Legal black slavery existed for about 1,000 years, beginning in the 9th century and ending in the 19th century. During that time, over 25 million Africans were taken by force, 5 million of whom would die while being transported. From the 9th century to the 15th century, Africans were taken from their homes and transported across the Sahara to be sold by Muslims in the northern countries of Africa and in the Mediterranean Sea area. The first step in the process was Africans preying on fellow Africans. This first wave of slavery, known as the Trans-Sahara Wave, accounted for just over 10 million slaves. The second wave, the Transatlantic Wave, began in the 15th century when Portugal established slave trade posts along Africa's western coast. Christians were responsible for the second wave. Most Americans are probably not aware that slavery was not a European invention. Long before Europeans became involved, it had been practiced by Black Africans and by Arabs. In many African societies, slavery was accepted, and black ownership of other blacks was just a way of life. If that comes as a shock to Americans today, it is probably even more shocking that Black Americans owned other blacks, more than 10,000 of them according to the 1830 census. Legal slavery in the Western Hemisphere finally ended when Brazil banned it in 1888. Worldwide, legal slavery ended when it was banned on the Arabian Peninsula in 1962. Well before the American colonies, selling and owning slaves was protected by international law. The Spanish, Dutch, and English had been taking part in slave commerce for some time. Black slavery was introduced into the New World by the Spanish in 1503 and by the English in 1562. The English eventually dominated the slave trade, so it is no surprise that New England came to be a major player in the transatlantic slave trade. Before the American colonies, there was already a flourishing slave trade along the African Gold Coast, and black slavery was well established in the British West Indies. African intertribal warfare produced plenty of prisoners of war, who were used as fuel for the slave trade with Muslims. Slaves bound for the colonies were branded and shackled together before being boarded onto vessels for a 3-week to 3-month voyage. About 84% survived the unbelievably horrendous conditions, after which they were delivered by their slavers to the shores of colonial America. Apparently, the first black indentures arrived on American shores in 1619 on a Dutch ship, although they had not been requested. Exactly how slavery developed in America is a matter of some controversy, but we do know that at first English colonists preferred European indentures, even if they happened to be criminals from English jails. And some black indentures were released at the end of their period of service. But attitudes gradually changed, and by the 1660s colonists tended to look to Africa as their primary source of forced labor, and they began passing laws declaring slavery hereditary. Working in tobacco and rice fields in the South was not an appealing prospect to early potential colonial immigrants, especially compared to the economic diversity offered by the North. Even Southern whites and Indians already there refused to do it. So, the South was constantly faced with a severe labor shortage. Slavery slowly evolved and became entrenched to solve that chronic problem. Colonial dependence on indentured servants slowly evolved into a system in which all blacks were presumed to be slaves. The transition is not well understood by historians, but it is clear that by 1676 widespread legalized slavery was a fact of life in Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. Within another 30 years, the institution of slavery was well established throughout the South, and to some extent in the North. And so it was that every colony's legislature enacted laws called Black Codes, defining African Americans as property, not human beings. Slaves could not testify against whites in court. Slaves were too valuable to be killed for most capital crimes. They were not allowed to learn to read and write, own a gun or a dog, travel without a special permit, gather in groups of more than 6, or have sex with white women. Since most slaves worked either in Virginia tobacco fields or South Carolina rice plantations, that is where the greatest potential threat of slave rebellion existed. But even in those areas, revolts and runaways were rare. An important part of the explanation is that, even before being boarded onto slave ships, blacks had been intentionally mixed with other tribes to impose a language barrier. So not only did blacks not speak English, Spanish, French, or Indian, they often couldn't even communicate with each other. Any coordinated attempt at revolt was usually impossible, nor was it even contemplated, given their demoralized state. How then were slaves able to cope with such unbearable living conditions? Mostly through sheer determination to survive and hope for a better future, if not in this world then in the next. They developed a unique lifestyle which revolved around family, church, and faith. This rich culture is reflected in their music, dance, medicine, folktales, and traditions. It is truly a heroic story of stoic courage and resourcefulness. Here are some other interesting facts about slavery. Although the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, the term slavery did not arrive until 50 years later. By the mid-1700s, Americans imported about 7,000 slaves each year from Africa and the Caribbean. By 1763, free and slave African Americans comprised 15 to 20% of the American population, more per capita than today, 90% of them living south of Pennsylvania. By 1830, there were 3,000 slaves in the North, with more than 2 million in the South. In 1835, about 40% of Virginians and 66% of South Carolinians were black. About 95% of them were slaves. Obviously, it is difficult to understand how slavery could have been so deeply entrenched in America in light of the principles of freedom embraced so eagerly and passionately by early Americans. Whatever had happened before, no matter who was at fault, America had a chance to start with a clean slate on slavery with the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. On July 4, 1776, every state had slaves, but not one of them rushed to free them. Looking back on it today through layers of Yankee propaganda, it's not surprising that the southern states didn't free their slaves, but why didn't the North take prompt and decisive action right from the start of America? Why didn't they abolish slavery in the northern states and strictly prohibit the slave trade there? They may not have been able to convince or force the South to do the same, but the North could have led by example. They did not. Why? We will find out. America failed to take advantage of that opportunity in the 18th century, and we paid a heavy price for it in the 19th century. Such a colossal failure was partly the result of colonial rationalization and racism in both the North and the South. Colonists managed to convince themselves that Africans were not human beings, but simply property. European scientists had argued that blacks were an inferior species. The color black was associated with evil and witchcraft. Ministers taught that God had relegated blacks to an inferior status as part of the curse of Ham. All that, together with the South's desperate need for labor and the North's insatiable lust for profit, provided sufficient justification in the colonial mind for slavery and the slave trade. Most Southern colonists were not proud of slavery, but they considered it a necessary evil and they assumed that it would eventually go away. Many of the prominent founders privately acknowledged that it was an evil institution, and they had no interest in perpetuating it. Yet, they did little to end it, and some participated in it. The prospect of the peaceful demise of slavery, while not necessarily unreasonable at first, evaporated later with the invention of the cotton gin. During these colonial years, leaders were mostly content to kick the can down the road rather than confront the issue squarely. More than anything else, slavery in America was a failure of government to do the right thing. It is unrealistic, perhaps, to have expected our fledgling federal government, or even our state governments, to put a sudden, complete stop to the institution of slavery. After all, by that time it was such a well-established institution that dealing with it was extremely complex. But time after time our federal government failed to take appropriate steps to deal with slavery once and for all, even if that meant adopting a policy and program that took several years to fully implement. Instead, our government leaders continually avoided the issue, sought temporary compromises, and left the problem for someone else to deal with later.